has the facilities, and there's really no risk of the lights going out here in Britain in the short term.
OK, Poppy Trowbridge in central London, thank you very much for your assessment of that. I'm joined here at the Gherkin by Professor David Elms, Head of Warwick Business School's Global Energy Group, and also with me, Tony Judge, Energy Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies. Tony, I mean, the language, as I was saying, he's a man on his way out. I suppose he wanted a speech with high impact. But what's your sense? I mean, should we be preparing ourselves here for blackouts?
The writing has been on the wall on this for about 10 years. The government's obeying European Union directives, which means it has to close coal and oil-fired power stations. They could, in theory, run for some time longer to cover the gap. Electricity demand will start to rise as we emerge from recession. This is a perfect storm. It's going to hit as well as the coalition faces the general election in 2015. So politicians of all parties, Ed Miliband is a former energy secretary, should be watching this very carefully. We are going to have a very tight point in about 2015, 2016, when bills will rise with a carbon tax as well.
A perfect storm, David Elms, but not necessarily one that was inevitable. I mean, as the point that Tony's making there is, yeah, we've known about our ageing nuclear fleet for some time. We've signed up to promises and pledges about reducing CO2 emissions and about, pursuing a basket of different energy sources. This is a policy failure here, isn't it?
Well, we do have policy in front of government at the moment, which is about getting on with it. But you're right, this is becoming quite acute, and we need to think how, as a country, we can work with both government and industry to get on with the mix of energy that we need in the future.
I mean, do you share that view that there is going to be, in the short term, a period where actually the margin for error in terms of capacity, if there's a little bit more, just more than 5% more demand or 5% less supply, that actually we'll start find that the lights will flicker and in some cases will go out? I mean, is it that desperate?
There are things that compensate for that. We can bring electricity from the continent and so on. But yes, it is becoming very tight, and this is a warning that Ofgem have given for a number of years now. There is the legislation in front of government, and so it is a case of now is the time to get on. There isn't a second chance.
Political failure to act, Tony?
Completely. We have a situation where when we privatised electricity, there was no energy strategy in place. So the companies which bought what was the old CEGB stressed kit. They haven't replaced it. They importantly haven't replaced the diversity. We're going to be hugely dependent on gas. We won't see a new nuclear power station until about 2023 at the earliest. That's a problem for any government which actually has this policy in front of them affecting the electorate, which they can't actually now control.
The government has made pledges, signing two pieces of European directives, pledging to reduce CO2 emissions and get rid of old, environmentally unfriendly power stations. Is the solution here not just to simply back out of those pledges and say, well, look, the world has changed, it's a different place to when we signed them, and therefore we'll do things, but just at a slower pace?
I think they could look at, to call it an emergency reserve, call it whatever you will. They could have derogated and they could still derogate and keep these bits of technology, the oil stations which manage peak demand and the coal, on a little longer. They could do that. It's hugely embarrassing and there'd be a row with Europe, but it should look at it.
Do you agree with that? This is something you're looking at, the large combustion plant directive and the industrial emissions directive. I have to read from them. I'm not familiar with either of them. But, should the government look again at the pledges it's made?
It would be very embarrassing. These have been around for a while.
But they're unrealistic promises now. We're not going to reduce our CO2 emissions by 50% by the mid-2020s, are we? But we can close power stations, but the lights will go out.
It is also about moving to cleaner, more efficient power, and that helps the economy.
Sure, but are these not now unrealistic promises?
No, there is still time, but we really are getting very close to the time when it is too late.
Part of the problem here, is it not, is that the government has relied on the private sector to deliver the infrastructure that it wanted. I mean, it's interesting. Alistair Buchanan seems to point the finger here at the financial crisis. He seems to be saying, well, everything was on track. We were going to get all this wind power and all these nuclear fleets, and then suddenly, oops, there's a big global recession. Is it that simple?
Actually, Alistair Buchanan should thank the recession because it has meant there's been a collapse in electricity demand, which has meant this hasn't been exacerbated sooner. But in actual fact, if the truth be told, and Alistair Buchanan is going off to do other things, it's not a failure of the private sector, it's a failure of government to set set out a strategy for the private sector to follow. It shouldn't have let them sit on kit they bought in 1990 with privatisation and basically to run them out, stress them out, which is what they've done.
Do you agree with that view?
We're looking at a new relationship between business and government. We had a long period of time when government left energy to the markets. Now we're trying to change the energy, and you need a tighter relationship between government and business.
But
so I would put a bit of the fault on both sides. It is a new world we live in.
But the government wants nuclear power to play a part in the generation of electricity in the future, and yet it is absolutely relying on the private sector to build those nuclear plants. And there's no sign of much progress. Things are being delayed, they're set back, and it will be 2020 at the very earliest before we get any extra coming online.
And that's the difficulty, because we're looking at a mix of energy, some of it renewable, some nuclear, some gas, and so on. And we're spending a lot of time at the moment arguing what we think the prices will be in the future, what we think the costs will be in the future.
On that point, manage our expectations. The average domestic energy bill has gone from around £500 in 2004 to about £1,300 today. I mean, can we expect double-digit, inflation-busting domestic energy bill rises for the short term, the next 10 years at least?
I think you can, and I think that is very depressing. I also think you keep talking about the consumer, which you're right to do. You should also talk about industrial customers. Energy-intensive industry, which faces high bills, will either relocate or it will axe employees. That will take out a lot of our manufacturing renaissance George Osborne wishes to see. The other thing is, which is important, is that we're about to have a carbon price floor introduced on April 1st, perhaps a bad April Fool, but it isn't. That will most certainly increase electricity bills, because most of our electricity still comes from coal and gas.
David Elms, domestic bills going one way and fast?
They are likely to go up. You know, we're unlikely to see some of the factors that reduce them, say, that we've seen in the United States. And it is this question of, it's not just about building the new power stations, it is about making industry more efficient, it's about you and I changing the way we do things in our homes. So it is this balance between a broad mix of new energy sources, so that we're not dependent on, say, international gas prices, and also work to make the way we use energy more efficient.
Very briefly, I mean, in terms of where we get our energy from in future, it's a debate. We've decided that nuclear is an option. The Germans have decided, though, that they're going to phase nuclear energy out, that it can, it doesn't have to play a part in the future. I mean, do you think renewables, the renewable potential is, there was lots of excitement about how much it could generate, electricity it could generate. I mean, is it a bit of a busted flush now? It's such a tiny percent of our electricity comes from wind power and so on and so forth.
Compared with the subsidies we've put in, the whole thing's been a total pantomime and a waste of money, and that will ruffle a few feathers. But the fact is, it's doing a tiny amount of our baseload capacity.
Okay. And a pantomime, you'd agree with that?
No, I think it's an investment in the future.
Fine. OK, Tony Lodge from the Centre for Policy Studies, and Professor David Elms from Warwick Business School's Global Energy Group. Thank you both for joining us to discuss that. Belgian police are searching for 8 men who carried out one of the biggest diamond robberies of recent years.